Hi, everybody. My name is Laura Kelley, and I am chair of the Miami-Dade Democratic Party. And today we have a number of guests to talk about multiculturalism, faith, and our interfaith breakfast that's coming up on May 30th at the Biltmore Hotel at 8 a.m. And we're going to have some more information about that. But before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment, since we are talking about faith, to acknowledge the passing of Pope Francis. And I wanted to take a few words of his from his last Easter address that I think are really pertinent to what's going on in our world right now. He said, "On this day, I would like all of us to hope anew and to revive our trust in others, including those who are different than ourselves or who come from distant lands, bringing unfamiliar customs, ways of life, and ideas. For all of us are children of God. And I appeal to those in positions of political responsibility in our world not to yield to the logic of fear, which only leads to isolation from others, but rather to use resources available to help the needy, to fight hunger, and to encourage initiatives that promote development. These are the weapons of peace, weapons that will build the future instead of sowing the seeds of death." And I just thought that was a perfect introduction to what we're all doing here, is talking about our different faith traditions. And so on that note, I'm going to have everybody here introduce themselves, starting with you.
My name's Khurrum Wahid. I'm an attorney here in Miami, practice mostly trial work, criminal, civil trial work. I'm also on the board of a civic engagement organization that is very faith-based called Mosaic Miami. And we have the longest running clergy dialogue in the country. I'm also the national chair of Engage Action, which is Muslim American civic engagement.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Sue Whitman Helfgott, and I am a member of the Democratic Executive Committee here in Miami. I was raised a Roman Catholic. I, in fact, went to St. Thomas Aquinas High School in Fort Lauderdale, for those of you who know that school very well. Later in life, became a Jew by choice. I've been active in Democratic politics for most of my life. I've had a career in finance. I'm also an author. And I'm very happy to be invited to talk to you today.
Hi, I'm Max Cantor. I'm the owner of a strength and conditioning gym in Wynwood. I'm also a lifelong Democrat, and I studied at Jewish Day School, Solomon Schechter, and the Hebrew Academy in Philadelphia. I consider myself a very strong but cultural secular Jew, and most importantly, as of 8 months ago, I am a girl dad.
Hello, I am Dr. Stephanie Best. I am a professor at Miami-Dade College. I teach English and social science classes. I am also a practicing Catholic. I am involved in the volunteer work with the Archdiocese of Miami, and I am also the chair of the Interfaith Committee at the Miami-Dade DUC.
Excellent. So part of our interfaith breakfast that we're having, we're going to have former Ambassador Stith, ambassador to Tanzania, and a reverend talk about renewing America's promise. And I guess I wanted to ask each of you, how does your faith tradition speak to the idea of renewing hope or promise in our community and our country?
Well, I think that in the Muslim tradition, there's this sense of really looking towards the future. And that comes from the idea that we have a faith in an afterlife. And so even if you've made mistakes in the past, there's always redemption. And you can walk that journey, and that's what the future is about, is to always be looking at not, lamenting the mistakes of the past, but looking at what we can do better together moving forward and trying to redeem ourselves and the communities that we're a part of. And I think that is really timely right now. I feel like we're in that moment right now where I know my faith as a Muslim American really speaks to the kind of work I do. I believe very strongly in redemption. That's where my criminal defense background, I suppose, leans into that. And I really do believe that it's community oriented. We can't do better on ourselves alone. We have to work with others. We have to work cross faith, cross ethnicity, because we have to really look at ourselves as humanity as opposed to just our own silos. Unfortunately, I do think that we get into these silos, and that comes from a lack of perspective. We get very micro on our faith sometimes, very stuck on traditions and sort of checking the box as opposed to understanding the big picture. What does God want from us? God wants us to be better human beings to each other. And I think that, for me, that is how I would like to approach the world.
Sue, do you have something to say about that?
So I actually have known Reverend Stith for many, many years, and one of the reasons I find him a remarkable man is that he has this wonderful background of being both a faith-based minister, having been ordained at Harvard, but also involved in business. He has a corporation that does financial work in Africa, between putting American investors with African counterparts. He also had a huge amount of responsibility for managing $500 million in grants that came through to help people of disadvantaged economic positioning and women in Boston back in the 70s and 80s who were having trouble getting loans for houses, which we can all appreciate today a lot. And the reason he's speaking to this issue about renewing America's promise is that, you know, we all grew up thinking we were the good guys, right? We won the Second World War. We believe strongly in this division of church and state, and yet all of our work as a country has always been based on our faith values of helping our fellow man. And it seems we are living in a world today where people have forgotten that compassion does not equal weakness. In fact, it equals strength. And I think we need to, as a country, remember our responsibility. We have great privilege here, and with it goes great responsibility. And I hope that that's the message. Whether you're from a Jewish background, a Muslim background, a Buddhist background, we all share in that philosophy that we are here to help our fellow human beings. And I'd like to see us get back to that.
Absolutely.
I would say that Jewish history has been marked over the last 5,800 or many years by waves of darkness and light. But what's always emphasized is finding that light in the darkness and finding your agency in the darkness. There's a concept of tikkun olam, fixing the world, which I think even in different faiths we believe in, if we don't necessarily, we might use different words. But it's really that joy. There's so many scenes that we grew up with of a family huddled together in an attic in Germany in the 40s, evading the authorities and figuring out some way to commemorate Shabbat or a holiday or wrapped film, literally putting their lives on the line, but finding that little spark of joy that connects you to the history, to the thousands of years. And I agree with everything that was said, but I think that that spark of joy is still there, and I don't think things are that bad. And, you know, comparatively over the course of world history, but the key is whether they're good or not to make them better. And, you know, some of the darkest periods in our history have followed what we thought were, you know, good times. So always being aware, but being appreciating for what we have and being ready to make it better.
Yeah, I would say for me, Catholic social teaching centers on this idea that every person is created in the goodness and likeness of God, and that all people have dignity. All people, no matter what, you don't have to earn that. And just reflecting on Pope Francis and the impact that he's had on not just our church, but in the world, something that stands out to me is people that are not Catholic have been moved by him. And why is that? I think it's because we've really been kind of pushed outside of our comfort zone to act as good Samaritans, to center showing solidarity with the most vulnerable, with those in our community that need help. And so I think just, you know, even sitting at this table with people across different faith traditions and beliefs, and that we are in solidarity and community with one another, is an example that I'm glad that we're able to share.
Just can I add one thing to that? I think we were talking about this as Jews. There's a lot of things we might not have agreed with the Pope on, for sure. Mm-hmm. But it's so rare for people in power to really walk the walk and take the hard position. He did things that did not really ingratiate himself to the cardinals around him. Mm-hmm. That seemingly he did out of his true spirit, true beliefs, and that's something I think we were saying.
Yeah, it's integrity at the end of the day. It's integrity and really understanding. I think for me, I was raised Episcopalian, so not Catholic, but similar, strongly influenced, and the idea that we redemption, of course, and then also that we are all in this together, where it's community. And the scripture, to me, he's somebody who has followed the scripture in a way that I think so few people in positions of power in certain religious backgrounds are not. And it's rather than, again, weaponizing our divisions, is bringing us together. And I think that's fundamental. And one of the things that I have been saying to the community is that there's more that we have in common than divides us. We all want to be safe, healthy, and prosperous. We all want to, we all want our community to thrive. But we may have, slight changes or differences in policy, but at the end of the day, in the Venn diagram of beliefs, most of us are right there together. And for me, that is my democratic values. And so I'd like to ask you all, in what ways do you see democratic values such as justice, equality, and care for the marginalized reflect in your faith?
So I definitely think that, and I think this is probably common to all faiths, right? Which is that really the underlying voice of God is the ideas of compassion and mercy and caring for one another. There's always every book has an angry voice of God, for sure. There's always the fire and brimstone piece to it. But I think that at its core, all the way through, it's trying to teach us, how do we interact with each other, those who are of our tribe or not of our tribe, and how do we interact in a way that moves us as a society to be better, to leave this world a better place. In the Islamic faith, there we have zakat, which is a mandatory, giving 2.5% of your asset wealth to charity, right? And that makes that community very charitable. Statistically, in the United States, one of the most charitable because of that requirement. And it bleeds out into not just when you're required to do it, but it creates within us this sense of helping your fellow man, helping others, regardless of who they are, what their background is. And I do think that you have an opportunity if you can really live that, you have an opportunity to connect with other human beings on that level. Right now, we're seeing, a lot happening, I think, politically in the country that really challenges that perspective. It seems there's some policies out there that seem very inhumane. Yeah. And we, as I think, a faith community, we need to step up and come together to resist those policies on the basis of our collective morality that we get from our faith. So I think there is an opportunity for us to use our faith right now to try and rectify what we're seeing happening literally right in front of us.
Absolutely.
I don't think I can add much to that. So well said. We've all the Democratic.
I charge by the minute.
Oh, okay. The Democrats have always been accused of being a big tent party, and that is both our blessing and our downfall, because we try to encourage everyone to be in our party and to have inclusion. But it gets back to what Stephanie was talking about, which is, there is a basic human dignity that each person is born with, which has nothing to do with their innate skills or which home they happen to be born into, or whether they were able to get into the top schools or whether they were not able to do so. And we in our country do believe that everybody has equal opportunity. And what I think you've been trying to say is that we are living in a time now where that equal opportunity does not feel as equal as it really should. We see attacks on education, public education. We see attacks on individuals who want to live in a slightly different way than what is the standard Father Knows Best, 1950s black and white sitcom or whatever. And, you know, I was raised a Catholic, and one of the teachings of Jesus, which has always resonated with me, is that you do to the least of my brothers, that you do unto me. And so it isn't about the art of getting ahead or making the deal or whatever people are now thinking is the measure of a person. It's about what you're doing for someone else, and doing it humbly and without any wish for any remuneration attached or getting something in exchange for it. That's what America, and I think that's what the Democratic Party especially espouses and is trying to do every day as we get out there and live our lives.
I'd touch on the opportunity side, and in Judaism, concept of charity or tzedakah, it's not a perfect translation, but I think it was Maimonides has 8 levels of tzedakah, and the lowest level is being forced against your will. I guess that's taxes. Beyond that, you have giving in your name, trying to get credit, giving anonymously, giving where the recipient is anonymous and you're not. But the highest level of charity, more than giving, is to give someone the tools to make their own living. And that's what I think about when I think about opportunity, right? It's, what can you do that the person doesn't need that anymore? And then the other thing, so that I think about a lot with Tikkun Olam and Judaism. You mentioned justice. And anyone who's read Talmud or Sanhedrin knows that most Jewish teaching is just pages and pages of legal argument. And not all of it that important. Sometimes, like, if a cow knocks over your fence, does the owner of the cow owe you 1 section of fence or 2? And they'll spend 30 pages talking. I don't remember what the answer was. And even in the Noahide commandments, which are in Judaism, we tend to ask very little of non-Jews. There's 7 things you're supposed to do, most of which are reasonable. Don't kill, don't steal. Some of which are a little specific. But one of the 7 is to establish courts. The one thing the Jews think non-Jews should do, establish courts. And I think that's because we've seen what happens to us when the courts are bypassed. And it is very tempting. Feels good when you have someone bypassing the courts to go after people saying nasty stuff about you. And I see a lot of my fellow Jews celebrating this. And I think that is a very dangerous thing to do. I think we all know what we're talking about. Some of those people, I find what they say absolutely reprehensible. But even if it's legal for the government to pull a visa without a conviction, it really makes my blood boil to be pulling visas from people for thinking the wrong thing, even if I really hate what they think. So I think a lot about courts and establishing courts.
That cow should get a lawyer, by the way. In your story, the cow needs a lawyer.
There are cases where animals have had lawyers.
Yeah, totally alarming.
I mean, I might be misremembering the story. There's always examples like if a bull, mauls your dog, whatever, the dog bites back.
It's whose perspective did that cow knock over that fence?
The amount of
maybe the cow was pushed. Maybe the cow was asked to come over.
That argument was had.
Yeah.
How old was the fence?
That's why it's 30 pages.
In Sanhedrin, I believe you need a court of 70 judges to unanimously agree to issue the death penalty, and I don't think that was ever actually done in the period.
Interesting.
We need that here in Florida.
Yeah.
Go find 70 judges.
So I'd say within the Catholic tradition, there's a really big emphasis on faith in actions. So that means that the way you live your life, the way you treat others is the measure by which you live your faith. As Sue was mentioning, right, Jesus tells us that the way that we will be judged is how we treat the least of those. How do you treat people that can do nothing for you, right? That you are just being their neighbor because you're called to be their neighbor. So I think when I look at policy, I think the way that we can judge our society is how are the least among us doing? Those who need some help to get by. And I think when I think of famous Catholic leaders within the United States, we're not always like screaming Jesus from the rooftops. It sounds something like, ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country. That's the first Catholic president, right? And Joe Biden, often talking about those who need extra help, what we do to make sure those who don't have opportunities have opportunities. And so for me in my life, that looks like when I'm teaching, I always be open to, I'll teach who no one else wants to teach. What classes do you need somebody for? That's why I teach like 20 subjects now. Because it's this idea that everyone deserves a shot, everyone deserves an opportunity, and that we see everyone as our neighbor. And, you know, living that out isn't always a explicitly religious thing, but for me, it is internally.
And, you know, I just want to go back to this idea of this big tent, because we do have, I think that's a misconception about the Democratic Party, is that somebody will say something and that will be, this is what the Democratic Party stands for, when it's just one person. I've heard some people talk about how they feel abandoned and left behind by the Democratic Party. I think we all felt that in 2024 in various ways. But I think what people have to be reminded of is that, so the Democratic Party has a platform. We have values. We sometimes will weigh in on policy, but it's actually candidates and elected officials who put forth their own particular policy. And that's why we have primaries, to determine which candidate better represents our views. And then that's why we have elections. And so it's important, I think, for people at home to understand that the Democratic Party does not necessarily support one viewpoint over the other. And I think that can sometimes lead people to believe that we're wishy-washy, that we don't take a stand. But the truth is, the party is here to have values, to do this community work, to meet people where they're at. And it's for candidates to create their particular policy, and of course our elected officials to create the laws. And then in this country, we still have the Constitution so far, and it's the separation of powers, like what you were saying, Max, is that we need to have we have to have the courts that check both the legislative power and the executive power, just like we have how all of them operate. And I think it's just what you said. I can vehemently disagree with what somebody else says without taking away their right to say it, right? And I think what you were saying earlier about how this impacts your community work, that those of us who are attorneys, right? Criminal defense, right? We represent people who maybe everybody wouldn't necessarily want to represent. And there may be some people who believe that they don't deserve to have representation. But the truth is, when we don't have that representation, that means that can happen to us. If we can see ourselves in the other, that means that we can have that level of compassion and service for others, that we cannot, if we can't see ourselves in another person, that's the compassion piece, that's the empathy piece. And that's why we do, I think what we do is to make sure that we are all protected under the laws of this nation, and as influenced by our faith and our other values. Because I think they're interrelated and not necessarily exclusive or mutually exclusive.
And along those lines, also the idea of reconciliation is very common among faith traditions, and this idea that there is mercy, there is forgiveness. So just because somebody has not been perfect or has done something wrong doesn't mean that there's not a chance for them to be able to be reconciled with society, to make amends and begin again.
I would also say, as Jews, we're very used to being the other. Like we rarely have our own tent. We're very used to being in a big tent, and I don't think it requires compassion to want to be inclusive to people who are kind of on the out group right now, because so much of our history is us being in the out group. So the more we create a system that allows that out group to exist, that's not compassion, that's self-interest. And that's how I think about these people who are getting deported, that I find absolutely reprehensible, and the only thing worse is actually deporting them. I find far more reprehensible.
Well, and I think the question then becomes, at what point do we realize that compassion is self-interest, right?
Fancy. Well
I mean,
done.
what I'm saying is that
Well done, counselor.
that there's people often say there's no such thing as altruism, right? But the truth is that if you understand that we are in a society where, well, we've always been tribal, right? And that's why we have our different tribes. But at the same time, that we survive throughout the course of human history in community, that without our tribe, without our community, we would literally die. We would starve because there's no person can live on their own, uh, even today, I would argue. And so when we protect each other, we are protecting ourselves. When we create community, we're protecting ourselves. And that, I would say, it may look like self-interest, but there's a larger good. And I think the rugged individualism that has created our country is there, but we have to find a way to rectify that and reconcile that with a larger community, because rugged individualism is largely, I think, it's a nice story, right? But it's not accurate, because nobody is an island unto him or herself. I don't know if anybody had something to say about that.
I think that it turns into how we can engage. I think as a party, and those who are running for office, how do you engage the faith community better? And I think that there's a narrative out there that the Democrat Party doesn't want faith as part of the party, which is ridiculous, because we have every single community you could think of as part of the Democrat Party, literally officially written in our bylaws. So I think that what we have to do is figure out, how do we tap into that better than we have been. And for me, and I see it right now, when I was up in Tallahassee recently talking to a bunch of electeds, there are bills that are moving through that the faith community should have a voice in, because it speaks to their moral centers. And we just have to engage them better about it, whether it's criminal justice reform issues, and we're talking about redemption and mercy and compassion, or whether we're talking about those types of bills that might infringe upon free speech or freedom of religion even, right? Like, those are things that community will get engaged on if we educate them that this is what's going on and pull them into the conversation more. So I think that is a piece that maybe we could focus on better, because there is the one thing you can say about faith communities is that because if you can tap into the connection between the faith that they espouse and, as you said, the action that's going to happen, you can really mobilize them in a way that is much more aggressive, shall we say, than you can most other communities. I have, my two daughters are definitely, in their early mid 20s, and their community rises and falls on things that happen in social media and in the news and things like that. And so they'll move on from something. I don't think you see that with faith communities. I think that they can, if you can tap into something and say, hey, this is something that really goes to the core moral values you hold dear, they will continue to fight that fight, even if we lose that particular battle. And I think we should and bring them in much more aggressively than we have been.
I would also add on to that, I think that a lot of the values of the Democratic Party are in alignment with the values of most of our faith traditions, because we do hold a lot of values in common and practices in common. I was just actually having a conversation with one of my colleagues a few weeks ago about kind of the parallels of fasting for Lent and fasting for Ramadan.
Yeah.
They're not the same thing, but they are similar in practice and what they do for you spiritually. And I think facilitating more ecumenical conversations, because we are a big tent party that includes people of many different religious backgrounds or people who don't have a religious background, and that we can maybe even find a way to facilitate conversations about how we do have shared values that we can tap into and build upon. I think that would be very motivating. And I think that for a lot of people, their faith communities are where they find community and a place that we should connect with. I like that.
I love the emphasis on values. Going back, Laura and I have had many policy disagreements, but those are disagreements over the best way to promote the values that we both completely agree on. And going into values, I have a very secular worldview that in terms of specific policies is not the most compatible with some religions. However, thinking about Pope Francis, for me, that's the North Star of one way the Democrats can reach out to faith communities better, which is even when you disagree with the teachings of a given church or synagogue or mosque, if they see you being consistent with your values, I know people respect that, right? And I think we all can name Democrats who have not lived up to that standard, and that is the opportunity for us, is for our electeds to live up to that standard.
And I think also just even when we don't, because we are such a big tent, we're not all 100% of the time going to agree on every single issue, but when we center our conversations around respecting each other, seeing each other as sisters and brothers, as neighbors, and centering that, there's space to have a different opinion on a policy issue or something, but still be in community with one another and still see that that person has good intentions and good values, and build on that solidarity, build on that community.
Absolutely. Well, in line with that, one of the ways we want to build those bridges, mend those fences, and bring people of different faiths together is through this interfaith breakfast that we are having on May 30th. And again, Ambassador Stith will be speaking about renewing America's promise. People of all faiths and no faith also are invited to be part of this breakfast, about this conversation, to meet and break bread with one another. It's going to be again at 8 a.m. on May 30th at the Biltmore Hotel. And if you would like more information about it, you can write events at miamidadedems.org or interfaith at miamidadedems.org. And we would love to see you there, because this is how we continue the communication, create our community, and again, learn from one another. So thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.